Welcome to GW Integrative Medicine, the podcast about disease prevention and health promotion from the Office of Integrative Medicine and Health at the George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Sciences.
I'm Dr. Misha Kogan, Associate Professor of Medicine here at GW and Medical Director of the GW Center for Integrative Medicine.
And I'm Janet Rodriguez, the office's Administrative Director. Today, we're joined by Bevin Clare, MS, RH, CNS, an herbalist, nutritionist, and professor and program manager of the Masters of Science in Clinical Herbalism at the Maryland University of Integrative Health.
She holds an MS in Infectious Disease from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, serves as an Adjunct Associate Professor at the Massachusetts College of Pharmacy, and is an Adjunct Associate Professor at the New York Chiropractic College.
Bevin is the president of the American Herbalist Guild, the largest body of professional clinical herbalists in the U.S.
Welcome to GW Integrative Medicine, Bevin.
Thank you.
We're really glad you joined us, Bevin, and we know you have a really busy schedule. So what is clinical herbalism?
It's always such an interesting question because I think there's a lot of ways to answer this. To step back, I think herbalism which is often clinical by nature, is probably one of the oldest careers, particularly for women. But this has been a vocation or career throughout all of our history, that people would be healers, they'd use herbs, and so on. That may not be what you're evoking in your mind when you're thinking clinical herbalism, but it is one of these fields that it has been adopted by every single culture in the world, and is central really to health and wellness, up until you kind of get to the point of conventional modern medicine happening that we have now. And then, it got shifted a little bit to the side through a lot of the things that have gone on in the world. But, clinical herbalism in a nutshell is people using plants for medicine, but it's a lot more than just a pharmaceutical substitution model. I think a lot of people think, it's like instead of using antidepressants, you can use St. John's wort. It's much more of an overall wellness model that it supports health and well-being. It's not something that you use necessarily to treat disease exclusively, as much as to sustain and maintain health. So I think it's almost a little bit closer to nutrition than it is to what people would think of as a therapeutic medicine. In a practical sense, it's the use of herbal products in health and wellness and disease care. And we often, or typically, are using these products in formulation, or using them along with other herbs in teas, tinctures, salves, and then perhaps things like capsules and other more conventionally comfortable products for people.
Great, such a good answer. Bevin, I'm sure that some of our listeners are going to wonder, you have this fascinating combination of masters in sciences and infectious diseases and herbalists and nutritionists. How do you combine all this? I'm sure if we have an infectious disease doctor, for example, listening to podcasts, they're probably wondering, herbs for infections? Are you kidding me? So just curious, how does this all evolve? And I'm sure you have a really good thoughts as to, I actually highly disagree. That I think herbs for infections can be very profound. We're just really not seeing that done in a clinical settings in a standard model, but really love to hear your point on this.
Yeah, there's a number of ways I can answer this question. I'll try to do a couple of the most interesting takes on it. But for me, herbalism came first. This has been, in a way, you could say, a lifelong interest or calling. I've always loved to go out in the woods and play with plants when I was a child, make, quote, medicines, not even knowing what they were. And that created this, long-term interest and love in this. And when I was a teenager, I started studying herbalism in a very kind of casual, folksy, read books about it, had some teachers, learned how to make some things, and just, probably at that age thought I knew everything there was to know, because that's what it's like when you're 16 and you're studying something. And so, I spent this time with it. When I was in my very late teen years and my early adult years, I bought a one-way ticket to Southeast Asia. So, and this was in the 90s, and I decided that that I was going to travel. I love to travel. It's still a huge passion of mine, and I was going to learn about herbalism. What I didn't expect was that in a lot of the regions where I was in the world, they didn't have a lot of travelers, almost none, like Myanmar, remote Cambodia, Eastern Indonesia. And when they would see a white woman walking around, they would assume that I was either a missionary or a doctor and that I had medication. So I had this fascinating and really ethically challenging situation of people bringing me their sick. And I mean, literally sometimes in their arms. And I was young and I had no idea. So for in the beginning, I was like, no, I am so sorry, but yeah, no. And it was difficult because there was no medical care. It wasn't like I could say, you should go to the emergency room. There was no option, and so it was this difficult place to be in. But I think between being kind of a precocious youth and also having some trust in a lot of the uh, herbal medicines that we have, and also feeling like I needed to do something, I started trying to use my limited knowledge with the plants that I recognized there, which you could buy at markets and so on, to try to help people. It's complicated because as a white person stepping into these cultures that have intact systems of herbal medicine, I never wanted to impose, the impression of superiority of any type of medicine over their indigenous herbal medicine. But for some reason, that wasn't, cutting it. And what happened over this time is that I got to witness what herbs were actually capable of in fairly urgent care, mostly infectious disease situations. And this continued with my own health, with that of other travelers that I would come across. People were always getting sick, and we often didn't know what it was. And so it became very interesting watching what happens. And I think that that also is a good example of how herbs work with infectious disease, in that we don't actually even need to know necessarily what it is because of their broad immunosupportive activity and a lot of their ingenuity in how they work in the body. So, there's absolutely no comparison to the pure strength of pharmaceutical antifungals or antibiotics with plants. That if you compare them using the conventional criteria, pharmaceutical medicines are just a million times stronger, but at a cost, as we know, with antibiotics and so on. And so it's interesting, the botanical medicine that we have known that people have used the longest is myrrh. And that's because we have a bit of a bill from Syria to Egypt or Egypt to Syria. I can't remember what it is. Some kind of invoice for the sale of myrrh as an herbal medicine that's about, I think, 8,000 years old or so. And what's fascinating about that is that myrrh is still used as an antimicrobial and there's still no resistance to it. So, the
Hmm.
complexity of plants, it's not as strong, but it's really complex, and how they go about actually working with infection. So to answer, your question, I came back from those travels. I had a clinical practice in a conventional medical practice. I was their integrative practitioner, and to be honest, I met my husband, who's a academic medical person, and he was like, "You got to get a degree," And I'm like, "Oh, I'm having so much fun. I'm learning all these things," and he's like, "Yeah, you need to go do this." And I'm thinking, well, then in what? Like what field can I get a degree in that would respect a lot of the things that I want to bring into it? And infectious disease, particularly the program that I went to, is a little bit of a public health model, and which means you're working in places where herbal medicines are a big part of things. And although they're not always used, things like artemisinin in malaria, they are certainly on the they are on the radar of a lot of infectious disease people, particularly those who work in the world where not everyone has access to conventional care medicine.
Well, so I have now so many follow-up questions, but let me just don't want to put you on the spot, but let's start with
Do it.
this one. So, can you give us one example? Give example of more, but can you give us another example of herb that you would consider suggesting to a patient in some kind of an infectious process?
Yeah. So this is here's an example that I really, really love, and I love it because it really embraces the spirit or the essence of herbal medicine being about using whole plants. So if you take a plant, and what we like to do in science is, like, plants are messy. I mean, from a perspective of research, it's like you've got this thing that has 400 active constituents. They come in varying amounts depending on what time of the year it was harvested and by whom and what soil it came from. I mean, they're totally
Mm-hmm.
inconsistent. So what humans like to do is we're like, well, there must be one thing that's doing all the medicinal action in here. And this is how it's approached again and again, which, I always say it's like asking which one thing in your pizza is good or which one thing in your apple is healthy. I mean, it's a combo, it's a package deal. And it's a co-evolutionary process with humans. Like, this is not some random thing that was thrown together. And so we find this
Let me
one.
interrupt you
Yeah.
for a second. Sorry, I'm getting so excited here. I think this is a critical point, because until we, as a system, stop doing that to the
Right.
integrative medicine, we're not going to get the most benefit. We're going to keep assuming that our standard scientific methods, like, oh, let's isolate active ingredient in the plant. I mean, sure, there's still value in there. I'm not
Right, absolutely.
discrediting that. But I'm also saying that it is critical to look at the complexity and stop trying to isolate anything, because nature does not ever isolate anything. It includes everything. And I think we're, unfortunately, until we get that in our heads, it's going to
Right.
be, not optimal. Sorry, go back. I'm sorry.
No, yeah, well, I agree, because the thing is, we have to be able to be comfortable in a place of not really understanding how it's working, because we don't have models. We don't have models that can take a plant with 400 constituents and the complexity of the human body and figure out what's actually happening. But a great example, to address your question, is that. So when you look at an antimicrobial plant and you decide, all right, this is the thing, and let's take a plant like Berberis species, which is used, barberry. It's used all over the world, and it was used for kind of toxic heat in traditional systems, which is definitely an infection. And before there's germ theory and everything else, it's like if you have toxic heat in somebody's body, then you've got an infection. And so here, this plant is used in South America and Asia, in North America by indigenous people, because there's different species of Berberis. So when you look at this, and the researchers said, oh, right, well, this is really clear. There's a antimicrobial substance, berberine, which is used conventionally. It is isolated, it's powerful, and it's really interesting. But they said, here's berberine. This works really well. Let's test it, against antibiotics. And wow, it didn't work very well. I mean, it was okay, but it was like, clinically, it seems to work better. And part of it has to do with what they're leaving out. So some researchers looked a little harder at this and realized, that there's got to be something else going on. So they started looking at other compounds and found one called 5-methoxyhydrocarbon. And that compound, is actually an efflux pump inhibitor. So, for listeners who aren't familiar with the idea, is that pretty much all cells have some kind of ability to express an efflux pump to remove toxic substances from inside the cell and pump it right back out on the other side. And this is how drug resistance works a lot of the time, whether it's to chemotherapy or whether it's to antibiotics. These efflux pumps are ubiquitous in nature, and they're very efficient. Anything that's going to kill that cell, it just pumps it back out. So when they started looking at this berberis plant, they found, oh, wow, this particular substance actually paralyzes that pump. It's an efflux pump inhibitor. So in a way, it made that botanical so much more concentrated, because when you gave it to something in the antibiotic, compared it to the antibiotic in the whole plant, that the antibiotic was kind of getting pumped back out of the cell if it could be, but the berberis was concentrating because it was also paralyzing that pump to prevent that efflux. So that's an example. And from a practical standpoint, when you're asking like what can people actually use and how can they use it, I think that it's often safe and often okay to be using antimicrobial plants alongside conventional antibiotics and so on. I mean, it's great to check the literature, to ask your physician or to contact an herbalist and find out. But a lot of the time we can use these whole plants because whole plants are also inherently safer, or whole plant extracts in these care environments. And there's some really cool research that looks a little bit at this. What happens when you use an antibiotic alone, and what happens when you add in a plant that can actually help it to be more effective?
Great. So, second follow-up question goes like this. So, you mentioned it's that for certain herbs, there's been centuries of non-developing any kind of resistance. I mean, people have been using some of these products forever and ever and still use it, and there's no resistance. Versus look at the antibiotics world, some of them after a decade or two, and then you have to start looking for another choice. Why do you think that is? And I mean, I think I know the answer, but I want to hear it from you. And also, how do you see that being? Is it possible that the future of infectious disease is some kind of a mix between always looking for new antimicrobials, but also using herbs in some form of combination or as an adjunctive or something, just to keep effectively treating the strains that became resistant to most known antibiotics? Of course, there are many of those.
Right. Well, I think there's a few reasons why this is happening, but I think the main reason that plants don't seem to develop that kind of resistance, or that we don't see resistance to these plants, sorry, that is because the plants, they're not coming out of a little sterilized package. Plants are living out in the world, and they're living typically in soil. Soil is full of, I think we only can even classify or identify 1% of soil bacteria at this point. I mean, it's this hugely active microbial world. I mean, plants are constantly living with and assaulted by and having to deal with the balance of all of these different organisms. And so their systems are really complex in how they deal with this. They are constantly adapting, just like the complexity of our own immune systems as humans blows my mind every time I learn more and more about it. Plants are similar. I mean, they also have pressure from infectious organisms. So in some ways, we can actually adopt a little bit of that ingenious strategy that they have when we use them as medicine. So, again, it's coevolution and these pressures that for evolution, for biological development and evolutionary strategy.
Great. Let's those of our listeners who want to get a little bit more practical. You said that there's a healthy relationship with medicinal plants, goes kind of beyond the tincture and capsules. But can you give our listeners a little bit more practical ideas of how can they integrate herbs into their everyday life?
I would love to. One of the things that makes me a little bit sad about herbalism is that I feel like it's inherently a sensory, kind of beautiful, interesting medicine. And it's a little akin to, if you've traveled or you live outside of the United States, or you're in parts of places where food systems are much more alive and fragrant and vibrant. And I'm always struck when I walk into the grocery store that it doesn't smell like food. I'm thinking here's this
Mm,
huge place, full of tens of thousands of food products, and it doesn't smell like anything. And yet you go in other parts of the
I have
world to
never
places,
thought of that.
right? And you go in other places in the world to food markets, and it's like a sensory overload. I mean, between animals and herbs, and things are rotting and things are fresh and things are vibrant. And um, so herbalism is a little bit the same thing. And I often feel like at one point in my life, I volunteered in a kind of natural products section of a grocery store, so akin to a Whole Foods sort of thing. And whenever people would come and be like, "I'm looking for an herbal medicine," I always wanted to be like, "Actually, you're in the wrong section. You see all the place over there with all the brightly colored fruits and veggies? You should go over there and get medicine because." um, so, kidding aside, I do use tinctures and capsules and all of this, but in my day-to-day life, I actually don't. If I need medicine, like something is going on, I'll use those. But in my day-to-day life, it comes down to spices, it comes down to therapeutic use of spices, it comes down to just integrating a lot of botanicals into my life in a fun and you know desirable way. And we know how good spices and all of these things are for us. I mean, spices are just endlessly healthy. And there's also some other advantages that herbal medicine can be accessible, affordable, it can be multi-generational. You do not need to buy incredibly expensive products a lot of the time to be able to do that. And that, herbal medicine to me, above all, is the people's medicine. And I think everyone should have access to be able to use herbal medicine like it is in many parts of the world. And it's fine if we want to have, fancy niche products that are highly priced and, make gummies and things like that. That's fine if we want to do that. But my students sometimes, actually this happened last week, where they were saying, this client could take gummies as an option. And I was like, great. So we've determined that they need to be taking a 3-gram dose of this plant a day, right? How much would it cost in gummies? And they figured it out. They were like, it would cost $846 a month, and they'd have to eat like 34 gummies a day to get that dose. And I was like, okay, and how much would it cost if they were just adding it like to their food, 3 grams? And they were like, it would cost $7.65. And I mean
Hmm.
that's the point sometimes, is that we it's not better just because it's like fancier in a package or has a label on it. There are ways, particularly in health prevention and wellness.
I think it's a critical point. I think as a culture, we have forgotten what food as medicine truly means.
Right.
We're going to the latest and greatest pill for every ill kind of thing, forgetting that this sort of kind of relationship with the food chain is the most therapeutic. And like if anybody ever traveled to, like I went to Ikaria, which is a like little island off the Greece some years ago, and I've seen this firsthand. Like they don't go and garden stuff, like right, they walk outside, and in their natural setting, 100 feet away from their house, there's all kinds of plants growing. They just know exactly what to pick for whatever they have. And we don't have that in our culture. And I'm so kind of happy that, and that goes to the next question. I'm so happy that there are few people like you who actually saying, wait a second, we haven't fully lost that art. So with that, can you tell us about your book? Because I know that's sort of, there's tons of practical information in the book that just came out last year in 2020. Just kind of overview it a little bit for us.
Sure. So the book Spice Apothecary is about translating some of that information that people see about things being good for something into how they can actually use that without buying a capsule or a product. One of my favorite examples is cinnamon. So there's lots of research on cinnamon, and as far as diabetes prevention or blood sugar stabilization, tons of research on cinnamon. It's also very well liked. As far as plant flavors go, cinnamon is something that a lot of people are like delicious. And yet And also, I will say that the dose of cinnamon is shown to be pretty small. It's a gram a day, which for herbs is pretty small. That is the kind of ideal therapeutic dose. In fact, if you do a lot more than that, sometimes it doesn't have as powerful of a medicinal effect, or as it's not as efficacious. And so we have all this research to back it up. People see this, and primary care providers even are like, "Oh, wow, cinnamon could be good." And then it's like, "But where do we go from here?" Well, I guess you should buy a cinnamon product, and you should take a capsule, 2 capsules every day, which is approximately a gram, which is silly because cinnamon is absolutely delicious and easy to take. And a gram a day is just like kind of a heavy sprinkle on your oatmeal or your applesauce or your smoothie or in whatever you want to put it in. So so the concept in the book is not just about that, but it's also about how to cook with a lot more spices and herbs, or prepare foods with a lot more spices and herbs that you can use every day. For example, the idea of create taking hummus, even just packaged hummus, and adding a lot of different herbs and spices that are specifically targeted in a therapeutic direction. So whether somebody has concerns around healthy heart, or immune health, or something like that, it's evidence based, and it's also informed by tradition. And so it kind of walks people through, if you think you should be taking these herbs, here's how to get a big enough dose. Like, here's how to actually get a therapeutic size dose, but in your food. And I'm especially interested in this from the accessibility angle, because again, I think that, this is, in this day and age, we hear so much about the social determinants of health. We hear about institutional racism in our medical system. We hear about all of these different things, and herbs and spices are so good at fighting a lot of those kind of those those destiny diseases that so many people are predisposed to because of food deserts and poverty and all of these other reasons. I just, if I was in charge of the world, which I don't want to be because it would be terrible, but one of the things I would do is just, all these folks who have, it's really hard for them to find quality food and to have the resources to prepare it and to eat it, and multi generations of folks who we can look at and say, like, it is very likely there's going to be heart disease and diabetes and arthritis and cancer coming up in this for this family. Is start from day one with, like, here's herbs you can add to whatever you're eating. Even you can microwave something and you can add a whole bunch of herbs and spices if that's what it comes down to.
With the wonderful side benefit of it tasting better.
Yes.
You can take something, you can take some canned black beans, some frozen corn, half a container of salsa,
Yes.
throw in some spices, chop up some cilantro or some oregano or some flat leaf parsley, and toss that in there, and suddenly something that could have tasted very mass produced tastes fresh,
Yes, yes. And
and it's
and there's
healthier for you.
exactly. And there's a million and one ways this can happen. And I have to say, I was inspired a long time ago, when I was first practicing, by there's a woman that I was working with, and she was from, I think, Poland, and her husband, they're very Polish. And they came in, and it was for him that they came in. And I gave them an herbal formula, and and when they came back in, I asked him, how's it going, and he said, I'm fine, I'm feeling better. And I said, oh, have you enjoyed taking the tea? And he said, I've never taken a tea. And I was like, okay. So I, I said, what about the herbs that I recommended? How did that go? And he's like, I haven't taken any herbs. And his wife was blushing, and I'm thinking, how do you sneak a tea into somebody? I mean, that's kind of hard to do, right? And so she just, I said, how is this happening? What's happening? And she kind of, I was like, just tell me, it's okay. And it turns out every week she would make sausages for their family, and that
Hmm.
was a part of their life, that what they did for their diet. And every day he had sausages. So she just added the herbs into the sausages, and and he ate them. And what, to me, I was like, wow, heat and fat are really good for absorption of these phytochemicals. I mean, it's
Mm-hmm.
ideal. And I just thought, right. I mean,
I
why
can
not?
see I can see Dr. Frame like hearing this sausage every day having a heart attack. But okay, hey, well, that's the cultural sensitivity, right? I mean, that's
Yeah.
how cultures use this
Right.
basically, 1,000-year-old history of the plant-based medicines, and hey, however you can get it in, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, so for our listeners, Bevin Clare's book called Spice Apothecary, blending and using common spices for everyday health, and it is on Amazon in Kindle hardcover and paperback. And it did came out in the sort of like first 6 months of pandemic.
Yeah.
I'm not going to ask you anything about that. So it's just, I can only imagine what you had to go through. But when this mess subsides, hopefully soon, we should have you back for some book signing event.
I'd love it.
The cover looks so pretty with all the
I
spices.
know.
It's awesome.
Yeah, and I can even bring down some tasty nibbles or something. But yeah, the whole book tour was basically like, oh, because it was right then. It was in
Yeah.
May of 2020. So it was right when we were
Mm.
like, I guess it's just going to be a couple more weeks of this and then it'll be over. No, yeah, so but it's done really well, and people are enjoying it, which has been great. Maybe it was just what people needed during the pandemic.
Now, Bevin, tell people what your website is, because I just fell in love with it when I went to start doing some research for the show.
Oh, well, it's bevinclare.com. So that's BevinClare. There's no I in Claire. And I have a whole bunch of different things going on there. Some travel related things, some spice related things, clinical herbalism related things. So it's a little bit of a mishmash. And I'm also on
All of it is
social media.
very appealing.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so you're not only a provider and an educator and an author, you're also an activist. And you're involved in something called United Plant Savers. Can
Yeah,
you?
I feel like activism comes in some ways. I feel like I almost partner and with a lot of people who are fabulous activists in whether it's bringing clinical herbal medicine to the underserved or whatever it is. But United Plant Savers is a group that helps to protect and create educational resources around at-risk medicinal plants. And this came and we started a long time ago, 30 years ago or so, where there was just such popularity with medicinal plants. A lot of them were basically getting wiped out, and to create more
Mm,
awareness around how we need to cultivate these things. I mean, this is not a new problem. We've been wiping out herbal medicines for a long time, and so. But we need, now we have a whole supply chain, and so there can be some corporate responsibility and so on. So United Plant Savers, especially with our eastern woodland plants, I mean, the area that we are all in, I'm assuming we're all in the mid-Atlantic, is just rich with the medicinal plants that the world wants: golden seal and ginseng and black
mm-hmm.
cohosh. And I mean, this is their native environment. And with with all of the pressures on native ecosystems, we need to make sure consumers are aware that a lot of things that they're using, you need to make sure you're getting them from ethical sources. And so that it's about creating awareness around that.
Now, I think people are used to hearing about an endangered animal.
Hmm.
Um, but so tell us what's happening out there. Is it because of urban sprawls or excuse me, suburban sprawl, or h- how are these plants disappearing?
Yeah, it can be, it can be habitat destruction, it can be climate change and change of ecosystems. It can
Mm-hmm.
also be over harvesting. A great example to make your listeners aware of is the popularity of ramps. Have you seen ramps like in cuisine or in the grocery
Mm-hmm.
store?
Mm-hmm.
So, these little these little plants, which are, they're tasty. They're not that much tastier than garlic or onions, to be honest. But those little bulbs, they won't flower or reproduce until they are 8 or 10 years old. And
Wow.
right. And what happens, you can eat the green part and the ramp is fine. But that's not what happens. You can go through a hillside and you can absolutely kill and pick up every ramp plant. Just it's like harvesting a little onion. You just pull it right out of the soil, bring it over to Wegmans and sell it, and they are gone. I mean, they will not come back from that hillside
Mhm.
where they were. And so I think a lot of eco-friendly natural food types are like, ooh, ramps. This is like a wild food. This is so cool. I want to eat that. And they don't, nobody's thinking, is this actually sustainable? Like where are these coming from? And it's the root. So, if it's the leaf, I love the idea of people eating wild foods that come from plants that you have to make sure the plant keeps staying alive when you're
Mhm.
harvesting it, because that would actually ensure survival of a species. But there's a lot of that out there. Golden seal is one of the ones. Golden seal is actually CITES listed on the endangered species, threatened and endangered species list. But that doesn't really infect our domestic commerce. It's more international, and so that is again another problem, because golden seal, it's a great medicinal, but it's one of its top uses is still for people trying to thwart drug tests, which it doesn't even work for, but
Jeez.
it's sold like crazy for this. And here's this beautiful plant that's
Yeah.
threatened, that's being used carelessly.
Well, we will definitely make sure to have some links in the show notes for people who are interested in learning more about this and possibly getting involved in helping to preserve these plants, because just the same way, if you live along the shore, you know to throw the pregnant blue crab back in the
Yes.
water.
Yeah. Yeah.
We can't over harvest these plants.
Yeah. Yeah, and United Plant Savers is a small grassroots organization. I mean, people's memberships really do help support it. It and there's botanical sanctuaries all over the country. So if listeners have, woodlands or gardens where they like to grow native medicinals, you can actually become a botanical sanctuary, which is really fun. It's not like
Oh,
a
that's
legally
cool.
defining
Hmm.
thing. Yeah, but it's about kind of saying like this is a safe place for medicinal plants, and you know, that's the intention.
Well, I wish we could keep running this forever.
It's fun.
With so many questions for you. No, no, this is great. Janet knows what's coming, but I was not planning on doing this, but I just can't get you off of the hook here. So we're very fond of medical cannabis in this establishment, and I don't really see this as anything different, but yet another plant. But unfortunately, the whole field got hyped up and kind of took a life of its own. But just how do you see, the cannabis and just let's say the whole plant, whether it's a hemp or cannabis, it doesn't really matter. How does it, in your opinion, fits in a kind of a global plant medicine?
Oh wow. I mean, it's such a complex thing right now, isn't it?
Mm.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like I don't even know what it is. Like, is it a plant still? No, I mean, I know it is a plant, but I look at some of the direction things have headed in, all the edibles, um, y- and and I don't know what to think. I don't know if I'm like, woohoo, look at this plant. It's like doing amazing things. It's changing the world. It's like from all different directions. Or if I'm like, what have we done? I mean, humans are so good at taking this beautiful things that are already amazing and intact, sometimes doing awesome things with it, and sometimes just kind of bastardizing it to the point where you don't even know like what is this. But I think it's yeah, I can't think of a more complicated plant unless we start getting into some of the opiates, which aren't really plants anymore. Maybe cannabis could be similar in those lines where that where we've taken it so far away from its natural form. But I know that a lot of you use this plant in forms that actually are respectful and aligned with the actual idea that this is a living plant. And Yeah, it's I think the interesting thing for herbalists is that especially those of us who've been in the field for a while, is that back in the day when you say, "Oh, I'm an herbalist," people would, make the motion of smoking a joint and be like, "Yeah, man," or something like that, and you're just, you'd always
Really?
look, yeah,
Yeah.
and so you really had to like disassociate yourself from that and be like, no, no, that's not our thing. So when it became a thing, it was like some herbalists really got into it and kept up with the learning curve. I'm probably one of the ones that was like that just stood back and went, "Wow, I'm glad some people are really keeping up with this field and the potential." And I would need another lifetime, I think, to really get there. But as you said, I just hope we don't forget that this is like a plant that's
Yeah.
yeah,
The,
real.
the the problem is that the plant is still scheduled substance, and I think that
Hmm.
causes this whole mess of the system go into direction of what you describe. It should be it's a weed, for God's sake, right?
Right,
So it
right.
should be one of the easiest things to grow and use in a day-to-day armamentarium for all kinds of things in life. But anyway, I'm kind of saddened that we have to wrap up soon. So,
I know.
but let's end on a kind of a bright note of. Can you give our listeners a couple of clinical pearls, like sort of the things you already gave us some, but maybe one or two more?
Yeah, I will give you some clinical pearls. I think one of the things I hear from providers a lot of the time is, oh, we can't really use that because we don't have the evidence or the products aren't regulated enough. But actually, we do have a lot of evidence on a lot of botanicals. I mean, you actually just have to look at for it. There's a lot of gold standard, double blind, placebo controlled, randomized clinical trials on plants. But even when there's not, plants, herbalism, herbs, for the most part, are more like foods. And I think, providers often will recommend, broccoli or something, or fruits and veggies without really knowing how they work. I mean, if someone's like, you should be eating more fruits and vegetables as a primary care provider, and you ask, well, how do those work? So they're like, there's vitamins and minerals and fiber, but really, when you look at something like broccoli, like that stuff is, there's a lot going on there.
Hmm.
So, herbs are a lot like that. Like they are a spectrum. They start from, things that are more gentle than broccoli and less complex than broccoli, and go all the way over to, plants like coca and are, things that where opium comes from, where cocaine comes from, where poisons come from. And there's a spectrum. And so a lot of our medicinal plants are very much on the food angle. I mean, a lot of them have no known toxicity, and so it is okay to play with them. I mean, you don't have to thoroughly understand, especially, so what I would say to listeners is to learn how to use a few. I mean, especially our food-based plants that are generally regarded as safe by the FDA, things like cinnamon, things like turmeric, um,
Hmm.
things like garlic that prevent a lot of uh, degenerative diseases, that are incredibly therapeutically valuable, and don't disregard them because they are so mundane. I mean, garlic's antimicrobial powers, when we look at things like tick-borne diseases, respiratory diseases, it just makes so much sense. And yet, people are like, oh, that's just garlic. But I would put my money on garlic for preventing a lot of respiratory diseases, because when you eat a lot of garlic, it's not your breath that smells like garlic. Like your respiratory cells are actually exuding garlic. I mean, you are this is for real. It's not about vampires, or it is if you consider vampires being infection. But these things really are, they're really suited in a lot of very specific ways. And so, play with herbalism, learn how to use a few different plants, and use herbalists. Find herbalists as resources. If you go onto the American Herbalist Guild website, you can see registered herbalist members who have passed a peer certification registration process, that have biomedical literacy and understanding, and are often really happy to interface with primary care providers, and patients alike.
Is that broken down by state?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. There you go, folks.
Well, I think that is all the time we have for today. Thank you, Bevin, so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure.
This is the GW Integrative Medicine Podcast from the GW Office of Integrative Medicine and Health.
I'm Dr. Misha Kogan.
And I'm Janet Rodriguez.
Thanks for listening.